Okay, we are in our study through the book of Acts. If you're new with us today, we've been going through the book of Acts for 40 weeks now. And we will go for quite a few more, but we're getting through. And God is good, and I think we're learning some good insights. As we said from the beginning, the book of Acts is about the continuing work of Jesus through the life of his disciples. That's what it's about. And we're seeing how God is at work and how Jesus is bringing about his intention for the church. In that process, we are also learning, though what we read took place a couple thousand years ago, we can still apply the principles that can be pulled out of there. There's great truths to be learned in the application of our living life as part of the church. God's intended process for us to be able to relate to him is through his church. And so we have a great deal we can learn. We finished last week. I'm not going to do a complete review of how we got to where we are. It would take about 40 weeks. But I will give you a quick review that last week we were in Acts chapter 17. Ron Mitchner was leading us through that. And in Acts chapter 17, Paul was in the city of Athens. And in fact, I think I've got a map. I'm going to throw this up there because I am one that sometimes it helps me, except I realize as it's up there, you probably can't read anything. So what I'm going to tell you, what I want you to see that might help you, is if you see the red arrows, or what those are, down in where this corner, down here, right-hand bottom corner as you're looking at it, is Jerusalem. And this is his second missionary journey, which we are covering now in this portion of Acts. And Paul went north and up to Antioch, where he was launched from there into his second missionary journey. What I want you to see, if I could do an overlay here, is that Antioch is in present-day Syria. And then as he continues on, he continued into Turkey. Much of where he traveled was in Turkey. He went across to Greece and came down and then sailed back and ended up back in Jerusalem. So basic countries that he covered would be modern day, would be Syria, Turkey, and Greece. And so obviously you recognize Athens as being part of Greece. And all of what we're going to look at today, it takes place in Greece. The other interesting thing about that is, from a historical standpoint, is Paul was hitting major cultural centers of Western civilization. Athens was kind of, and the impact it had on Western civilization, even in Corinth and these other places. And God had led by his Spirit, directed Paul in these areas to bring the good news of Jesus. We're going to also discover something else today, is that, and you may not know this, that when we read through the book of Acts, we are not knowing of the only spreading of the good news. We follow through, and Luke, Dr. Luke, is the guy that wrote Acts. He traveled with Paul. He records for us what Paul was doing on his missionary journey. The work of Paul is what makes up much of the New Testament. We could go how that came about and all of that, but the church leaders at that time decided this is what needed to be canonized and this is what we have. But I want you to know Jesus was not working only through Paul. Now, that's one of the things we will slightly get a hint of in the section that we go through today. I think that's important for us to understand, is because sometimes we can read this, and this is God's word recorded for us through Paul. God was working in other ways, and so we see how those things start to interconnect. And one of the things I'm going to do today with Paul is we also need to understand that in his travelings, he established churches in these different cities where he went. And he went back to them again and encouraged them, but then he wrote letters to them. Well, that's what much of the New Testament's about, the letters to these churches. What's helpful is, I'm going to do this a couple of times today, I'm going to jump from Acts to some of the letters so that we see what was going on from another angle for Paul as he is in these different cities and different things he's encountering. Okay? So and I encourage you in your reading now, as we're going through Acts, we have a challenge as a church. Keep reading through the book of Acts. Continue through it multiple times till we're done with this series. I hope you've had a chance to get through it several times now. The more you go through it, any book in the Bible, the more you go through it, you start to pick up on the flow, the purpose, and you begin to understand a clearer picture of what Jesus is doing, especially here in Acts, what Jesus is doing to establish his church. So I encourage you, keep reading in that. And then I'll reference some places today. Well, when he's in Thessalonica, we have 1st and 2nd Thessalonians letters to the church in Thessalonica. He's in Ephesus, letter to the Ephesians. When he is in Rome, he writes Romans. You see, you can find what's going on with Paul and get a better insight in what's happening in these places when you start to draw in from the other letters that have been written. Just a little insight for you. I'm sure you're aware of it, but just a good reminder. Okay, I want to jump to Acts chapter 18, and we're going to start with verses 1 to 4. And again, it's going to start with after this. The after this was he has just been in Athens. And it was what Paul talked about. He gave his defense of the gospel, the good news of Jesus, the God that can be known that they worship as the unknown God. And he now leaves Athens, and it says this: after this, Paul left Athens and went to Corinth. That's a distance of about 50 miles. They weren't very far apart. There he met a Jew named Aquila, and a native of Pontus, who had recently come from Italy with his wife Priscilla, because Claudius had ordered all Jews to leave Rome. Paul went to see them, and because he was a tent maker as they were, he stayed and worked with them. And every Sabbath he reasoned in the synagogue, trying to persuade Jews and Greeks. Okay, there's a lot there. Luke makes it pretty compact. I'm going to see if we can break it apart so we get a better understanding of what's transpiring here. One thing that we know is that when we are not told why Paul left Athens to go to Corinth, but we know that he went, and he went by himself. And so he traveled to the city of Corinth. Like I said, it wasn't far apart. Silas and Timothy stayed in Athens for a period of time, and they will, we'll see here in a bit, they will catch up with Paul. We don't know if Luke was with him or not. By the way this is written, if you remember back at starting chapter 10, or chapter 16, Luke starts to identify himself as one of those traveling with Paul. And he does not hear, and it's believed that he was still with Paul, or with Silas and Timothy, and caught up with Paul later. There's a reason why I'm laying this out for you, and it relates to what I was started with this morning, and I want you to understand the theme of where we're going so that when we start seeing the pieces come together, it will make sense. Every one of us faces difficulty in life. Challenges come from all different directions. Hardship is not something that it's not unknown to the followers of Jesus. And sometimes in our faith, we think having faith is a means of trying to find a victory over challenges and trying to somehow, because I believe in Jesus and what he's done for me, I will find my life slowly on this upward climb to heaven. And the problems are just falling away. And nothing ever, I'm Teflon. It just bounces off, baby. So it's like, sorry. The reality is, it's really quite the opposite. And those who choose to be followers of Jesus face problems like everybody else, and sometimes even more. And we have pain in life. Physical pain, emotional pain, psychological pain, financial pain. We experience pain. Why? Shouldn't we, if we know the creator and sustainer, the sovereign God that we met in the beginning of Acts, who is at work and can do the miraculous, why do we have to suffer? I want to give you a perspective. And I think I can very quickly and fairly easily back this up. Difficulty in life is the opportunity to understand God in deeper and newer ways. I'll say that again. Difficulty in life is the opportunity to see God and understand God in new and different ways. We as human beings are quite content to stay with what we know. God, I'm satisfied. You saved me. Good deal. Let's just go through life. Let's try to not rock the boat. But there are things you would not understand about God that God knows about you and what you need, that he is saying, this is what's best for you. Do you believe that? Do you believe that God is sovereign enough to be with you in the challenges and have a purpose to be accomplished through those challenges? Does he know you well enough? You see, we need to be able to get to a faith that is willing to be in the midst of a challenge and still seek God. Not for deliverance, but for who God is. Let's be honest real quick here. When you face a challenge or a problem, you're running late for work and you get the flat tire, and then somebody stops to help you, but they break your jack, and then the car starts back up, but it's something else, the radiator blows, and then the next, when these things are compounding, are you going, God, where are you and what do I need to know? Or are you going, God, get me out of this? God's intent for us is to turn life into living in his presence. I quoted the verse that we looked at in Acts chapter 17 last week, when Ron was addressing with the philosophers in the city of Athens. He says, I saw you had a statue to the unknown God. Let me introduce you to him. He is the creator of all things. In him and in whom we live and breathe and have our being. Do you understand the full encompassing nature that Paul is wanting them to understand? He is not a deity, which this is different than any worship of any god in that day in the city of Athens or any other city, that our existence, this became personal in the way that Paul is stating it. We live and breathe. In other words, he is the one that sustains us. I breathe him in, I exhale him. He is the one that becomes my very life. And in him, I have my being. I don't exist without him. Why is it we're often trying to exist without him? Because we want to be away from the things that make life difficult. If God is in the difficulty, why do I want to be comfortable? Now, I'm not saying we have to be masochistic and we have to be trying to, I go and slam my head into the wall and, oh, God, thank you. That's not what I'm talking about here. That God would call foolishness. It's walk with me where I lead you because I know you. You live and breathe and have your being in me. I have created life for you. I have a purpose in life for you. I am leading you. Walk with me. And in that we say, that's my faith. I'll walk with you because I know that you are there. And in that I will begin to have eyes that look to know and understand you in ways that I could not comprehend in the comfort of my recliner with a box of See's candy and a Coke. You see, we're about comfort. God is about life. And as followers of Jesus, we need to choose life. Okay, I gave you the heart of the message today. Now I want to back it up with what is going on with Paul. I want to take you outside of the book of Acts for just a second. Real short verse. I'm just going to read you something. This is out of 1 Corinthians chapter 2. Where is Paul right now? He's in Corinth. This is a letter that he writes to the believers in Corinth a short time after having been with them. He makes this statement. I came to you in weakness with great fear and trembling. Did you pick that up in the book of Acts? No, because Luke doesn't go into it. In fact, the way Luke writes chapter 18, he is drawing a connection for us to see that there's something going on in the life of Paul, and he is intending for us to try to discover what that is. Paul ends up in Corinth by himself, and here he tells us that he came in weakness with great fear and trembling. That seems odd for Paul, doesn't it? We've seen Paul stand up to all kinds of opposition. In fact, if we think about it, it's been a pretty brutal journey to this point. Don't you remember? I mean, in Berea, in Thessalonica, in all these different cities as he was going through, there was the Jews would respond with hostility, and in several of those places, they stoned him and drug him outside the city thinking he was dead. Another one, he was arrested and beaten in the public square and thrown in prison. He's been facing opposition constantly. So maybe if we put ourselves in the context of what Paul has endured, maybe we can understand why he makes the statement that he came in weakness and great fear and trembling. And maybe we understand why Paul left Athens to go to Corinth is maybe Paul, as things are are going well there, he's afraid he's going to face some opposition again. I honestly believe that Paul is reacting to the challenges that he was facing and had been facing on this whole trip. And what I want you to get out of that is Paul is no different than me, and he's no different than you. He's just a follower of Jesus doing what he believes God has called him to do. And so now he suddenly finds himself, and he's been going through one difficulty after another difficulty, and he finds himself in the city of Corinth. Let me give you some situational understanding for Corinth. Corinth is in Greece, as we talked about before. It's a Roman colony, and it's had a history for a period of time. At one point, it existed, and it was wiped out by the Romans, totally demolished, and it sat as nothing at all. And then the Romans rebuilt it into the city as it is here when Paul comes to the city. And in Corinth, it's very interesting. It sits on a very narrow bridge of land between a peninsula and in Greece, and it's a very narrow. And the city of Corinth actually had two ports, one on each side of the city, and it was a major commercial hub and had great influence in the whole region because of the fact that pretty much everything would come through Corinth that was going into Greece, or even going south into Turkey. And so in that, a lot of people went there. Now, here's what also is also known about Corinth at that time. It was, there were many different gods worshipped there, but it was the main temple of Aphrodite was in Corinth. Does the name Aphrodite bring anything to mind? I don't know whether I want you to or not, but the reality is it was a sex-based worship a supposed god. And in fact, it was known for, in Corinth, they had a temple there. That temple had over 1,000 prostitutes, both male and female. And it was a common phrase of the day that it was not a place for a young man to go. It was not a place for pretty much anyone to go if they wanted to return with their virtue. And so in that process, Paul is going to a city that in many ways is not friendly to the gospel. But that's where he finds himself. And there in the midst of that, we are told, the next thing we are told is about Aquila and Priscilla. They are two Jews from Italy. They have left Rome. I mentioned this a couple of weeks ago. During this time, Claudius has expelled the Jews out of Rome. That had an effect throughout the Roman Empire at that time. Jews for their faith were looked down upon, though it was still a recognized faith and religion within Rome, the Roman Empire. It was not seen favorably, okay? They were seen as problem makers. Here's why, and this is really, really interesting. Claudius kicked the Jews out of Rome because they were causing riots, continual riots in Rome. Do you know what they were rioting over? They were rioting over the fact that Jesus was the Messiah. Someone, we don't know who it is, had gone to Rome and began to preach the gospel, the good news. We haven't been told. We're not told this here by Luke. We're not told. We know historically by other historians that there was great uprising over Christos, over the Christ. And as a result of that, it was never ending. There were several attempts made to try to get to quell what was going on. Didn't work. That was it. Claudius was done, the emperor. Kicked them all out. And as a consequence, Aquila and Priscilla now end up in Corinth. They are tent makers, literally tent makers. And it just tells us that Paul went to see them because he also was a tent maker and he stayed and worked with them. We are not told whether Aquila and Priscilla became believers of Christ in Rome, but it does make sense if you get later, as we get later on in Acts 18. I'll explain, we won't hit that today, but I'll explain to you why it would make sense that they were. And the fact that Paul went to stay with them would seem to indicate that they were believers already when Paul came. And so he starts a relationship with them. He's doing a tent maker there, and he's working there with them. And what's really interesting is, and then on every Sabbath, he would go to the synagogues trying to persuade the Jews and the Greeks. So really he seems to be in Corinth just trying to survive. And as Paul even said, as I read from 1 Corinthians, Paul came in, and it would appear from a position of, I'll put it in kind of our vernacular day, probably depressed and dealing with anxiety. And he's there. There seems to be some uncertainty in just his, what's my purpose in all of this? But he continues to proclaim the good news in the synagogues. I pointed this out to you before. This was his pattern. He would go into a city. If they had a synagogue, and if you remember in Philippi, they didn't have one, so he went outside where the Jews would meet outside the city, and he continued to share the gospel. But he would use the synagogues as a means of reaching not only the Jews first, was his hope, but also would open doors to God-fearing Gentiles. Okay, so he goes, and he's doing this every week, and every Sabbath he is there. And I want you to also catch this, and I said it a minute ago, when Claudius kicked the Jews out of Rome, it would have had an effect in the whole Roman Empire because it would have set a policy for the Roman Empire. So it also means that in Corinth, the Jewish believers of the Jewish faith were not welcome in Corinth. They could be there. They hadn't been kicked out, but they were not seen favorably. That's the best way to put it. That will become important here as we get a little bit further in. So let's jump to verse 5. When Silas and Timothy came from Macedonia, Paul devoted himself exclusively to preaching, testifying to the Jews that Jesus was the Messiah. But when they opposed Paul and became abusive, he shook out his clothes in protest and said to them, "Your blood be on your own hands. I am innocent of it. From now on, I will go to the Gentiles." Then Paul left the synagogue and went next door to the house of Titius Justus, a worshiper of God. Crispus, the synagogue leader, and his entire household believed in the Lord, and many of the Corinthians who heard Paul believed and were baptized. Again, Luke really condenses a lot down, but a couple of things I want to just highlight with you real quick. We now have the arrival of Silas and Timothy, and most likely Luke as well. So now he's back with his compatriots. And in that, we see what the result is. He's now able to devote himself exclusively to preaching and testifying to the Jews that Jesus is the Messiah. So he is no longer having to provide an income for himself. It would appear that they brought support with them, probably from the other churches, and Paul is now able to focus his teaching back as he always has. And so he has an encouragement. Now, I want to jump ahead for a minute so we can get another insight as to what happened when Silas and Timothy arrived. I'm going to jump to 1 Thessalonians, and I want to read you a verse out of chapter 3. He says this is Paul writing. He says, "But Timothy has just now come to us from you and has brought the good news about your faith and love. He has told us that you always have pleasant memories of us and that you long to see us, just as we long to see you." Okay, so not only did he bring some support, but they brought encouragement to Paul. We know that from what he's writing right there. Timothy brought encouragement from what was going on in the other in Thessalonica and how Jesus is at work, and Paul is encouraged in that. So I want you to, what I'm trying to do for you is to see that there's a broader picture than just a couple verses in Acts. We have the whole thing playing out, and we're starting now. By the time we hit chapter 18, we are starting to get, from Luke, a little bit broader perspective, and I want you to see it in connection with the other letters that have been written, okay? There's a lot. What the perspective should be is the gospel has been spreading, and all of a sudden now it's really starting to spread and go big. And as I said before, we have Aquila and Priscilla, who are now and is believed to be, and we see pretty early on, it makes sense to understand that they are followers of Jesus. They became followers of Jesus back in Rome, learning the gospel and the truth of the gospel from someone we don't even know who it is. And so God is at work, and we're wanting to start, Luke is wanting us to see that even though he's telling us what Paul's doing, we're gaining insight into what's actually happening. Okay, now, back in Corinth with Paul. Did you notice that he again faces opposition? It's a common pattern. And it's the same thing, and this is what, if we understood contextually, if we were sitting there with Paul, we'd understand why, because it's the very reason that the Jews got kicked out of Rome. Anytime that Jesus is presented as the Messiah, risen from the dead, it causes all kinds of upheaval. And in Rome, they're rioting. Here they come out and start abusing Paul. In every other city where he's been, the same thing has been happening. And so in this one, Luke doesn't focus on the opposition. He focuses on Paul's response. And it says that Paul, at that point, he says, he shook out his clothes in protest. That was a physical sign of, I want nothing to do with you. Shake the dust off your feet. Shake the dust off your clothes. I don't want anything to do with you anymore. And so he's saying, look, I've tried to give you the gospel. You're not listening. You're on your own. And we can sense in this, and we should sense in this, Paul's pretty frustrated. He's still dealing with, this goes back, he is still somebody dealing with, I keep facing opposition. There keeps being problems. And he's wanting to bring that which will give them a life in a relationship with God. And it's like, can you understand his frustration? We sometimes read the Bible and we think these people, everything was great because God used them. God spoke to them. God, same purpose, same Spirit, same power. We should be living in the same expectation as Paul. And Paul expected God to be moving powerfully, and he's frustrated with the limitations. There's a lesson in that for us. We need to learn and live in such a way that we're frustrated when the truth of Jesus can't be told to our neighbors, to our friends, to the gas station attendant. We need to have a higher sense of anticipation and desire for God to be active. I feel it's much easier in our churches today. We can look to find something that we like and be comfortable with rather than something that's going to challenge us with that Jesus is still active through the life of his disciples, and that's what his church is about. How desperate are we to be an active element of the work of Jesus? And so Paul, in his frustration, and I think and I wonder sometimes if Luke didn't write it this way just to be humorous, but when it says, and Paul left the synagogue and he went next door. It's like, okay, fine, I'll go next door. And part of that is, we should have an image, is that they still saw Paul every day. Paul was still being heard by them, but he's now just, you're on your own. And he's going to focus on Gentiles. And then what's real interesting, like I said, Luke in this chapter writes it very differently. He's just condensing details in there for us to see things. And then the very next verse, he says, Crispus, the synagogue leader, and his entire household believed in the Lord. And many of the Corinthians who heard Paul believed and were baptized. So now all of a sudden we're seeing result of what was going on with Paul. It becomes important that the synagogue leader, the synagogue that wanted nothing to do it, and all this uprising, the synagogue leader actually became a follower of Jesus, which means, we'll see a little later on, a new leader of the synagogue rises up and they will arrest Paul. We'll see this in a minute. But I want you to, we'll see it here in just a second. God is still showing mercy and grace to Paul in the midst of the challenges that he is facing. And he is still seeing reward of the powerful activity of Jesus in his church to bring people to faith in him. Okay? Now, let's drop down a little bit further to verse 9. And again, this kind of seems to come out of nowhere. This just kind of is here. One night the Lord spoke to Paul in a vision. Do not be afraid. Keep on speaking. Do not be silent, for I am with you. No one is going to attack and harm you because I have many people in this city. So Paul stayed in Corinth for a year and a half, teaching them the word of God. Okay. I want you to pull back just a little bit what we walked through, and I want to see if you can catch what Luke is leading us through here. He's wanting us to see all the things that are going on. But one of the things that we need to understand is that Paul is struggling as he comes into the city of Corinth. Paul is facing opposition again where he has faced opposition all the way along. And now all of a sudden, we are given some details of a vision that Paul has where God tells him some specific things. What does he say? I am with you. No one's going to attack and harm you because I have many people in this city. And then we see Paul's response. He stayed in Corinth for a year and a half. Very condensed statements, but it's something we are to catch as the reader. Paul is struggling. God responds. Now, I want to jump forward to verse 18 of chapter 18 for just a second. It says there, we'll look at this more next week, but this is the connecting point that I want you to catch. In verse 18, he says, before he sailed, that's Paul, he had his hair cut off at Cenchrea because of a vow he had taken. Okay, now we're starting to get a little bit of insight of what was happening. Paul, somewhere in this process, and it might have been what led him to the city of Corinth from Athens in the first place. Somewhere in there, in his struggles, in what he was facing, he was being challenged, not in his faith, do I believe in Jesus, but in his, why am I facing these things? As he said, he came in fear and trembling. He was going through difficulty. I want you to catch what Paul did, and this is where it's easy for us to miss because we're not first century readers. When it tells us in verse 18 that Paul cut his hair off, yeah, he had a whole different ministry after that. He cut his hair off. Why? Because he had taken a vow prior to that point. And before, in 18, he's going to start returning his journey toward going to Jerusalem. He had made a vow to God. We don't know what that vow was, but we know the context in which that vow was made. One where he's facing great opposition, great difficulty, repeated problems. Things have been coming down hard on him. He's struggling, and he makes a vow with God. Just so you understand what's happening in 18, it would have been a vow where he, with God, probably a Nazirite vow, some of you might be familiar with that, where he would not drink any alcohol and he would not cut the hair on his head, as an expression of waiting for and anticipating God to be showing himself through his life. So that's probably why he cut his hair at the end of the vow. We don't know the details. Here's what I want to talk about for a minute. When you face problems, do you tend to cry out? Be honest with yourself. You don't have to tell me. Do you tend to cry out, God, deliver me? Or God, use me? The lesson we can learn from Paul is that the wise dig in deeper when things get difficult. They don't try to run away. They try to learn. They walk through. Again, you're not masochistic. You're faithful. And the wise understand that God is seen more clearly when life distractions focus me on him. Use and allow the opportunities of pain in your life. Maybe you're feeling depressed. Maybe you've had 1,000 things go wrong just in this last week. Maybe you can't pay your bills Monday. Whatever it is that you have been feeling, you've been fighting against, and it just keeps lining up, ask yourself and then go before God, how do I see you more clearly? Now, I want to take it even further. When was the last time you made a covenant vow with God? I'm going to guess if we went around here, probably come up with all of us together and say, well, maybe there was one time that somebody did. We have lost the perspective of what it is to make a vow with God. It is not a, God, you do this, I'll do that. You know, you give me all the money I need and I'll live a nice life that pleases you. It's not that. It's saying, God, in this situation, I know that you are in control of my life. I am living sold out for you. However, God, I'm struggling. I will dig deeper in with you. And as that, there will be an evident vow in my life that I will walk with you till I know your purposes. When you bring clarity to what you are wanting to do so I can see you and understand you with a focused, intense understanding. It's the opposite of running away. It's setting the anchor, driving the posts, tying myself to them, and God, we're going to weather this storm together so I can see you in it. That's what Paul has done here. Paul will not walk away because he knows that Jesus is still at work and God still has his purposes and the Spirit is still working through him. And we know that Paul refuses to miss the opportunity to know why God is doing what God is doing in this midst. Jesus, what do you want to accomplish? And he wants to see it. He wants to understand it. He wants to be more deeply involved with it. Paul, in the book of Philippians, makes the statement that I might, talks about the suffering. He might know the suffering of Jesus. Share in the suffering so that he will have clarity of understanding of what Jesus has done and who Jesus is. Jesus didn't die for me or for you to be solely focused on our retirement, on the next car we're going to buy, what thing's going to make us comfortable. Jesus died so that we could know God, and he allows the difficulties. He gives them as opportunities. Will you take them or will you bypass them? Will you sprint through them or will you walk with him? It's the opportunities to see, God, I am committed to knowing you more. And then I'm going to ask you another question. Paul walked through that period of time for that year and a half that he was there, did not cut his hair. Do you think it became evident to anybody else there was something going on with Paul? I'll tell you that it did. His companions, if nobody else. Paul, why are you letting your hair grow out? Let's go get a haircut. Not looking too good. I am letting my hair grow so I am not distracted by the circumstances around me, but solely focused on the purpose of God. I want to see what to do. I know, he told me, he called me as the instrument to the Gentiles. He wants me to proclaim the good news of Jesus both to the Jews and to the Gentiles. He wants me to use me, but it seems like every city I go into, I'm being stoned, I'm being cast in prison, this is happening. I've got marks all over my body. And I need to understand, again, I am focused, I am not moving till my faith fully is enveloped in the existence of God and his purposes in my life. It was evident even to those around him. I doubt, just out of an understanding of the vow, he wouldn't be out telling everybody that he was doing that. Hey, I took if it was a Nazirite vow, so don't offer me wine anymore, guys. I'm not taking it because I'm a little holier than you. It was, I'm set apart to God. I want to know him. I want to understand him. He has something to teach me in all of this that needs to be changed in my life. And he wants to show me what it is. I will stay until he shows me, and I understand. So I might encourage you, in fact, I'm going to talk about that in a minute, have a faith that allows you to make vows with God. Used to be much more common. We've moved away from it. Find things where you are struggling in your faith with God and commit to God. I'm not going to run from this. I'm going to learn of you in this. I could share with you, I was going through, when I was going to seminary, going through some challenges that just kept multiplying and compounding. And so I made a vow and said, God, I'm not going to do certain things, and made it to him, not for anybody else, until I understand what it is you want me to learn. And I discovered in that, not only did I discover God, but I discovered he knew me better than I knew myself. And he showed to me areas of my life where I could get in the way of the message of Jesus. And it's not that I'm past that. I've learned now I need to be sensitive to those things that he showed me so they don't become a problem. I learned a new perspective on God, and I learned something about myself. But in that, I made a vow. I do that from time to time. I've made vows as stupid of God, I won't have Coke again and that's a big sacrifice, by the way, for a period of time, because I still lack understanding in this area. And I want to see you in it. Until I see it, I won't drink that, because that will be the reminder every time I want one, I should want you more. We need to develop a hunger and a thirst for God that drives the very appetites of our lives, so that we are those who want to experience God first. And it's one of the lessons I believe we learn here from Paul. I want to take you just a little bit further in the book here. A few more verses. Verse 12. When Galileo was proconsul of Achaia, the Jews of Corinth made a united attack on Paul, I think I can read this morning, and brought him to the place of judgment. This man, they charged, is persuading the people to worship God in ways contrary to the law. Just as Paul was about to speak, Galileo said, if you Jews were making a complaint about some misdemeanor or serious crime, it would be reasonable for me to listen to you. But since it involves questions about words and names and your own law, settle the matter yourselves. I will not be a judge on such things. So he drove them off. Then the crowd there turned on Sosthenes, the synagogue leader, and beat him in front of the proconsul. And Galileo showed no concern whatsoever. We could read that and say, oh, that was an interesting thing. And it's beyond interesting. It's fascinating when we understand the context of what's happening with Paul. Okay, so real briefly, I want to show you this. As a proconsul, that's a very high ranking in the Roman Empire. So a law that he makes or a determination that he makes would actually have effect throughout the Roman Empire. Others would refer to him. Proconsul in, Galileo made this decision. It kind of laid down law. So this was far more reaching than just right there in Corinth. Becomes important. They brought Paul before the place for judgment, and they said he's persuading people to worship gods in a way that's contrary to the law. The law they're referring to there, and we talked about this a couple weeks ago, is Roman law. There were certain religions that were allowed under Roman law. Judaism was one of them. And what was happening was the Jews were trying to say, and this is what they're bringing before the proconsul, is that Paul is establishing a new religion that's outside of the recognition of Caesar, basically. And so it's not recognized. Therefore, it's an outlawed religion. For the proconsul, he's seeing this as the same thing that's been happening. They're arguing over this whole stupid thing within their whole context that they don't like this idea that this guy died and rose again and he's the Messiah. Do you see? It's the same argument for him. And that now that Claudius has kicked the Jews out of Rome, he's got this problem rearing itself up here in Corinth. He sees it through the same lens. And he responds to it and says, you need to go settle it because this has nothing to do with our law. This is a problem of yours. Stop causing problems. And when he makes that, when it says that he has showed no concern whatever when they beat the new synagogue leader, that's exactly the mindset in the Roman Empire at this point toward the Jewish faith. And he's like, it's your own stupid things that you're doing. You deal with it. But here was the effect, and this is historically known, that this decision here by Galileo, as a proconsul, it eased tension off of Christians, and they were still seen as a Jewish sect, but so they were able to continue to preach the gospel without hindrance from Rome. And it also spread to other parts of the Roman Empire. And so even in this, God is using Paul's situation to advance his church. Here's the other thing. Did Paul have to defend himself? He didn't, if you caught that there. Do you see that was a direct response to what God had said he was going to do for Paul? Because it goes that, God says to Paul, stay in the city, and I've got people here, nobody's going to harm you. Next thing we know, there's resistance against Paul, and they're taking him to stand before the proconsul. It would seem that maybe God made a mistake. However, before Paul can even say a word, the proconsul stands up on his behalf, and he goes after those who are attacking Paul, and as a result, the synagogue leader is beaten before him. Think about what's happened now. Paul's ability to continue to preach the gospel has just been opened up because of the words of this proconsul. That's why he's able to stay there for a year and a half preaching the gospel without hindrance. Because God kept his promise to him in the midst of Paul seeking him for understanding. God responded in a way that Paul could never have understood. He probably thought, oh, here we go again. God, I thought you said this wasn't going to happen. And before he could even open his mouth in defense, the proconsul speaks on his behalf. And as a result, the Jews are silenced for a long period of time. They know now we can't do anything against this guy because if we do, we'll suffer. And so God has responded to Paul's seeking him. He spoke to him and he acted on his behalf. You see, if Paul hadn't made the vow that he had made in the midst of his difficulty and sought to know God more clearly, he wouldn't have heard from God and he wouldn't have seen God act. And as a result, the church was blessed. Many thousands more came to know Christ. You see how God works? Do you see how important it becomes that in the midst of challenges and difficulty, we learn to dig into God, cling to him, seek him, commit to staying firmly before him until we feel that he's taught and shaped us the way that he desires? This is the lesson we can learn from Paul. And I hope you'll take it seriously. We need to understand that God is at work. Jesus is still building his church. God's purposes are still the same. We've been talking about that. Sometimes we lose sight of those purposes, and God allows difficulty to bring clarity. Let's seek the clarity in difficulties. Let's be those who are willing to make vows before God, not frivolously, please. We can talk about that some other time. But seriously make commitments to God. I'm willing to give up TV for a year to know you more clearly. Oh, Joel, you just asked for too much there. But do you get what I'm saying? Is there's things that stand in the way of your knowing God? I think God would answer, oh, yeah, there is. And I'm going to allow some things to help kind of remove them, bring clarity for you, because I want you to know me. And don't be ashamed if the vow you make is noticed by others, not from a position of somehow stating something that you're doing that makes you better, but from a position of an opportunity. I belong to Jesus, and I believe he's at work. I think there's good lessons for us to learn. Let's pray. Father, you are at work. We believe that. You have your purposes. Jesus, you're still working through your followers. We often get in the way. The way we look at life. I sometimes think we struggle to even understand. We say we know you, and we still don't understand what it means to live and breathe and have our being in you. Help us to understand that. Help me to understand that. And help us be willing to give up anything that might stand in the way that keeps us from seeing you clearly. And when we don't understand why things are happening, to have faith that you are sovereign, that not somehow you've forgotten. And in your sovereignty, we seek you to understand and to grow and to know you more deeply. So you can take us the next step and the next step. Help us to understand. Help us to grow. Help us to be willing to set aside the comforts of this life that may stand in the way, or to stand in the midst of the storm and say, God, show me what I need to do. Jesus, we give you praise. And in your name we pray. Amen.